Now I'll turn the program over to Cary ecologist, Dr. Jane Lucas. Dr. Lucas studies microbial communities. These tiny organisms play a key role in nutrient cycling, with implications for agriculture and ecosystem health. Her work is revealing the hidden complexity of microbial life, primarily in soils, with a focus on how microbes are impacted by warming, drought, antibiotics, insecticides, and other human-induced stressors. Who better to take us on a tour of compost? With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lucas.
Thank you so much, Lori. It's great to be able to have all of you joining us. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all about compost today. Just a moment here while I make sure I'm sharing my screen. And all right. So today I'm going to be talking about compost, give you a little bit of the biology behind compost. But before I dive into that, I want to take a moment to introduce myself. As Lori mentioned, I'm a microbial ecologist and soil scientist here at the Cary Institute. My work has really spanned quite a few different environments. I've worked in the tropics down in Panama to farms up in Finland. But a pretty constant part of my program is understanding how we can store more carbon in our soil ecosystems. I think a lot of us think about carbon storage, and the first thing that generally comes to mind is we think about plants and above ground, but I want to emphasize that soils are really important to our ability to store carbon because they're the largest terrestrial carbon pool. And so I'm constantly interested in how do microbes contribute to soil carbon storage below ground, and how can we maximize the storage capacity of our soil ecosystems? Now, I think composting is a really great way to get to know the global carbon cycle a little bit more intimately, because a lot of the principles that go into effective composting are the same principles that contribute to the decomposition process and below ground soil carbon storage. So knowing more about composting is actually really a great way to know more about our global carbon ecosystems. And I think there are a lot of reasons to get into composting, and not only does it provide us some information about how to better store carbon and understand how our world works, but composting is a way that we as individuals can contribute and help mitigate our own impact on our planet. And we can do that through composting by cutting down on the amount of food waste we generate. And I think it's really important to emphasize that we have a big food waste problem. In fact, right now, it's estimated that between 30 and 40% of all of the food on Earth is wasted. And if you look here on the right, you can see who's contributing the most. And we can see that residential households are really the biggest contributor to food waste. About 44% of all wasted food is coming from households. So if we as individuals can contribute and cut down on food waste, it's going to have a really great impact on the environment. And I think it's important to emphasize that when we're wasting food, it's not just that individual food item that's being wasted, but it's also the resources that go into making that food that are wasted. In fact, it's estimated that 1.8 billion hectares of land are wasted and 250 cubic kilometers of water are wasted, generating food that's just going into landfills. Now, these are pretty big numbers, but maybe they're a little inaccessible. So I want to give you an idea of what that actually means. And so the amount of land wasted is equivalent to all of the land in Canada and India combined. So that's a pretty large portion of our planet. It's also equivalent to 100 million Olympic-sized pools worth of water being wasted. So we really want to cut back on our food waste so we can not only save on the wasted food, but also help mitigate the impact on our environment. And as we are generating wasted food, we're also producing greenhouse gases. You can think about the fact that it takes energy, it takes gas, it takes oil to get food from the supermarket, from its source to our households, but then it moves from our houses into landfills. And when food moves into landfills, it ends up generating quite a lot of greenhouse gases. This is because most often landfills don't have a lot of oxygen, so food decomposes through anaerobic means. And a big byproduct of anaerobic decomposition is methane. In fact, landfills produce about 15% of all of the methane on Earth. And one thing to know is that methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. In fact, it's thought to be about 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So anything we can do to cut down on methane production is going to be really beneficial for our ecosystem. And I know that's kind of a lot of doom and gloom to get started, but I think one of the best things about food waste is that it's actually a problem we can all contribute to help solve. I want to emphasize that probably the biggest way we can cut back on food waste is reducing our generation in the first place. But as you probably all kind of deduced, compost can be an easy way that we can cut back on the food waste going into landfills. So today I want to go through some different kind of aspects of compost. I want to give you an idea of what compost is, as well as some of the principles of the parts of compost and the biology behind them. I also want to kind of briefly go through some of the most common types of composting systems to give you an idea of what might be a great match for your household. And then finally, we're going to do something that's a little new for us here at Cary, and we're going to do a live demonstration of how to start your own compost, as well as take questions about how to troubleshoot some of the common issues. So let's begin by just figuring out and defining what actually is compost. Compost is a humus-rich material that results from controlled decomposition of organic materials. And humus is probably something you maybe have heard before, but this is the organic component of soil. Oftentimes, if you go in your backyard and you see in your soil this really dark, rich material that's kind of spongy, that's natural produced humus. And it's mostly made of plant materials and microorganisms. One thing I do want to emphasize, though, is that compost is not the same thing as soil. It can be a part of your soil by bringing that humic acid and the humus to your soil system, but soil has a lot of components to it. So if you were starting your own garden, it's great to add compost in there, and it can be a great fertilizer, but it isn't a sufficient environment for the whole plant. You want to mix in topsoil and make sure you're getting a diversity of soil components like different parts of sand and loam and silt and clay. Now, compost is somewhat simple in that it's just made up of 4 basic components. There's organic matter, there are microorganisms, there's air, and there's water. And I want to go in depth a little bit into these different components because understanding what these different components do to your compost is a good way to understand how to maybe troubleshoot some of the issues that you have as you generate your compost at home. Now, the first and maybe biggest component that you think of when you think about compost is the organic matter. And these are the materials that we actually are putting into the compost pile that's going to generate our compost in the end. This is things like food scraps, maybe lawn clippings, all the different materials that we're going to add into the compost pile. Now, when we're trying to make an ideal compost, we are looking to add organic matter that has this somewhat magic ratio of 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And here you can see on this somewhat blurry graph, I apologize for that, is on the x-axis, you see days of decomposition and then the temperature on the y-axis. And you can see that this 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen is going to reach the highest temperatures, which is really good for our compost pile. And it's also going to follow this line where it makes compost faster than the other ratios. And that means that when you can reach this magic ratio of 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, your microbes are going to be really happy and you're going to generate the best compost in the fastest amount of time. Now, I'm going to assume most of you don't just look at items in your food waste and say, I know exactly what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is in them. So one of the things you can do is just look up some of these handy tables online. But just to give you a brief idea, things like kitchen scraps are normally around 15 to 1, which means they have less carbon and more nitrogen than our ideal ratio. So if you were only adding kitchen scraps to your compost pile, you're actually adding too much nitrogen, and that can cause quite a few problems. The first and maybe most important is that it becomes quite smelly. So when you have kitchen scraps, you might want to add that with something like wood, which has this very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And you just want to create a nice diverse mix of the different components in your compost pile to eventually get closer to that perfect 30-to-1 ratio. Now, that's how to make the most perfect compost. And I do want to emphasize that you can do lots of different mixes of compost. It doesn't have to make this magic ratio, but know that some of the common problems that occur in compost are when you get too far away from too much carbon or too little carbon in your compost pile. Now, if you don't want to think about these carbon to nitrogen ratios, a really good and simple way to think about this is that you want 2 parts brown material to every 1 part green material. And what do I mean when I say browns and greens? Well, browns are these kind of traditionally brown colored items that you might have around your house. Things like cardboard, firewood, maybe some leftover pine needles, shredded newspaper. These are all things that are really rich in carbon. They provide a great base for your compost pile, and they bring in that important carbon resource. But of course, you want to balance this out. So every 2 parts brown, you want to add your green materials. And the green materials are the things that you're most often generating inside the household. Things like vegetable scraps, maybe some grass clippings. In fact, even coffee grounds are a really great green. And I know that that's a little bit confusing because of course coffee grounds are brown, but they're actually considered a green from compost perspective because they have quite a high nitrogen content. So what you want to do is make sure that you're mixing these different types of browns and greens in your compost pile with a little bit more on the browns than the green. And the reason you want to make sure that you're getting a lot of browns in there is that they're going to provide a good structure to your system. But if you add too much brown, what you're going to end up having is slow compost production. That's because it's hard for microorganisms to eat things that are too rich in carbon. So if you feel like your compost pile is not moving quickly, one thing to think about is maybe adding a little more greens. Now, that being said, I think the #1 problem that people generally have with their compost is that they put too many greens in there. This is something that happens, and then you get a smelly compost pile. Maybe it gets kind of slimy because you've got too much of this wet green material. And so you really want to make sure to balance these, and you can always add more of one when you feel like you've pushed your compost pile too far to one side. Now, I do briefly want to mention a few things that you want to be careful not to compost. The ones with the stars are kind of a possible compost, but in general, people say don't compost animal products, fish, meat, dairy products. And a big reason for this is that these are going to be really big at attracting out animals. They are compostable though, so if you do have a tumbler system, which I'll talk about in a little bit, it is possible to compost some of these components. Another thing to be careful with is citrus peels as well as onions because they're quite acidic. Now, microbial organisms love a nice neutral pH in their compost pile. And so if you add too many acidic items, what's going to happen is it's going to push those microbes out of their happy living space, and it's going to slow your decomposition. There are other items like coated paper products, treated woods, things with a lot of chemicals that you just want to keep out of that compost pile, because that's going to be quite tough for your plants to eventually grow in, and also not things that we as humans will want to be consuming. So the organic matter is really the structure, the base of our compost pile, but the microbial life in your compost, those are the real engines. They're driving the show. And of course, as a microbial ecologist, I'm a little bit partial to them because they're so interesting, I think. And in fact, I think that a good way to think about compost is that you're actually farming microbes. You're trying to create this ideal mixture so that your microbial colonies are happy and working hard. Here are just a couple different types of microbes that might be living in your compost bin, things like the actinomycetes here on the left, and this fungal mold that often shows up in the later stages of compost. And the reason microbes are so important is that they are actually breaking down the material to eventually create that compost product. Now here I have kind of a basic graph where we have time on this x-axis and we have temperature on the y. We have both Celsius and Fahrenheit. And compost goes through these different types of phases. And the biggest thing to note is that temperature is a major contributor and regulator of the compost production. And it's also a great way for you to get an idea of what's happening inside your compost pile. Now, the first phase of compost is called the initiation phase. And what happens here is that mesophilic organisms or microbes that like it to be kind of that happy medium temperature begin breaking down the simple sugars, easy to access carbon compounds and nitrogen in your compost pile. And as those microbes are working hard, they start to generate heat. And this will happen over a couple of days, if not into about a week or two. But then something kind of magical happens at this 45 degrees Celsius. The compost pile switches over and all of a sudden it becomes the thermophilic phase or the hot loving phase of compost. And here a different set of microbial organisms begin to take place. These are organisms that are capable to break down much more complex compounds. So you'll see throughout the phases of your compost that maybe things like those little branches or pine needles might start to break down in this phase. And they are really hardworking and they're capable of generating quite a bit of heat. In fact, thermophilic microbes can bring your compost pile to almost 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's great when that happens because what happens when you get your compost pile really hot is that it kills off a lot of pathogenic bacteria. It's just like when we get a fever when we're sick, we kill off those pathogens. Pathogens can't handle the heat. And so what stays around are just your happy thermophilic microbes. It can also kill a lot of the seeds in your compost pile, which can be beneficial if you're putting weeds in your compost. You want to make sure it gets really hot so that it can denature those proteins in your seeds so that they won't take root later on. Now, eventually your thermophilic microbes are going to run out of resources and you're going to start to see that temperature drop back down as they decrease in activity. And what happens here becomes the maturation phase. And this is often quite a long part of the compost that's often dependent on the time of year. So if you're towards the winter time, this might take even longer. But what happens here is that now mesophiles again kick in. Oftentimes, this is a really high fungal activity time because the only resources that are left are tough, hard to access, complex compounds. And fungi are particularly well equipped to break those down. So right here, you might be here for a couple weeks to even 2 to 3 months. But at the end, you're going to have this beautiful compost product with the help of your lovely microbial organisms. Now, microbes are really important to this process, but in order for them to actually make this decomposition process and drive your compost production, they need to have access to air. And anaerobic and aerobic decompositions are the two types of decomposition routes that most compost piles go into. And we want to make sure that our compost piles have lots of air inside of them so they can stay in the aerobic phase of decomposition. You can see here what happens in the aerobic phase is that you generate a good amount of biomass, which would be our compost, but you also generate carbon dioxide. Now that's kind of just a natural part of the decomposition process. So it's okay to have this production in this setting. However, if you don't have enough air entering into your compost pile, it rapidly slows the decomposition process and makes it much harder for the microbial life. And in fact, you end up getting much less compost in the end, very little biomass, but you also get production of methane. And methane, of course, is unfortunate because it's quite smelly, but as I mentioned before, it's also quite a potent greenhouse gas. So we want to avoid that anaerobic. And one of the big ways we bring air into our compost pile is by turning and mixing it with some frequency. Now, the last component and important part of our compost is the water phase, or the water part of your compost. And as you all know, water is really the important basis of life. So in order for our microbial organisms to be able to take root and really grow, you do need a sufficient amount of water in your compost pile. Now we're aiming for about 40 to 60% water content. And that seems like kind of a lot, but in actuality, what we're looking for is about the consistency of a wrung out sponge. I think one of the biggest things that people tend to have go wrong with their compost is it gets too wet. And what happens when you have too much water, it fills in that airspace, it causes an anaerobic situation. And again, you're getting that methane production, slow decomp, and it starts to stink. On the other hand, if you have too little water in your system, it is going to slow decomposition because microbes do need a good amount of water to be able to happily function, create their enzymes, break down your components of your compost. Another thing to know about water is that it's really great at regulating the temperature. So if you have an open air compost, making sure that you have an adequate amount of water is going to be great because it will make your compost pile less susceptible to changes in external temperatures due to daily fluctuations. And so organic matter, microbes, air, and water, those are the main components of your compost. And if you can get all of those in there in the right ratios, you're going to be moving real well on your road to generating a rich compost. Now, there are lots of ways to approach composting, and I am excited to talk to you about kind of the most common types of composting. And the first one I want to talk about is open air composting. This is something that maybe you all have seen before or familiar with. This is great because open air composting is the type of thing that you could get started today with really no input. It doesn't require you to go out and get things. You can just get your compost pile started. It's really great as an option for larger families and places that maybe are generating more waste. Ideally, when you're creating an open air compost, this is just what's kind of seen as a pile of compost that might be out in your yard. You want to make sure that you're between 3 and 6 cubic feet. That's because you need to have enough compost in there so that you're generating enough heat. And if you have too much, it's hard to temperature regulate. And if you have too little, it's also hard to regulate your temperature. Now, there are some drawbacks to open air composting, and that in particular is that you do need outdoor space. So those of you in an apartment, this probably isn't going to be the best option for you. It can also take some time to get your open air composting kind of perfected, as well as to produce the compost in the end, because you are more open and at the will of the natural elements. So if you have lots and lots of rain, you might have too wet of a compost pile. The other thing to know is that open air composting does have the highest chance of attracting animals, and that's because it's fully open to the elements. As we do our demonstration, we'll talk about ways to limit that animal attraction, but it is something to think about, particularly in areas that you're concerned about animal pests. Now, a really popular, maybe the most common type of composting, something that you might have also seen, is bin composting. And this is what we're going to go through today in our live demo. The great thing about bin composting is it's extremely versatile. You can do it in a small space, you can do it in your yard, you can have lots of bins. It can be really versatile to what your needs are. The nice thing about composting in a bin is that because it's this enclosed unit, it's a lot more protected from pests. So this can be a great option for individuals who are worried about potential animals being attracted to their compost. You can store it inside or outside. And the biggest maybe drawback or difficulty with them is that you do have to make sure you're mixing them. Like I mentioned, you want to get that air in there. And sometimes if you have a really large bin, it can be difficult to get down and make sure you're completely turning over the materials. Now, a similar type of composting is tumbler composting. This is another type, it's a more fancy style of bin composting. This is, again, a really great option to keep animals out because most tumbler composts are fully sealed away from the elements. So you won't be getting animals that can easily get into your tumbler. You can also do a diverse set of food items in a tumbler. Because it's not open to the elements, you are more likely to be able to add some animal products, bones inside of there. The best thing about tumblers is that it is very easy to aerate them. So as we just talked about how important oxygen is to get in there to keep that healthy microbial life growing, this tumbler is an easy thing that you just rotate it 1 or 2 times a week. It mixes your compost and it keeps it nice and happy. It's also a relatively fast decomposition process because you can control a lot of the elements. But it does come with some drawbacks. Oftentimes, tumblers are a little more expensive to purchase. And I think the biggest thing you need to watch out for when you have a tumbler is your water content. They're not open, they don't allow for a lot of drainage most of the time. And so that means you have to make sure that as you're putting in fresh, new yard clippings, waste from your house, you want to make sure that you're not adding too much water, because then it gets really soggy, it has a difficulty draining, and then you're going to have smelly and slow compost. Another really interesting and kind of versatile way to get into composting is vermicomposting. And this is composting with worms. And this is a great option for a lot of different spaces, because vermicomposting can be done in about the size of a shoebox, or it can be done on a really large scale. So it can be great for small spaces. What you should know about vermicomposting is it's not just any type of worm. It's mostly this red wiggler or a compost worm. So you're going to need to purchase that, which means it takes a little bit more effort to start this type of composting system. And because you are trying to keep these worms alive, you do have to be a little bit more judicious in the way that you add nutrients to your compost pile. You can't add 4 limes in there. It's going to become really acidic and difficult for these worms. But the end compost product from these worms is really great. It's generally rich in nutrients. It's great for all different types of plants. And these worms are pretty fast at generating compost. Now, as we were prepping for this, somebody asked a really great question about whether or not we need to be worried about red wigglers being an invasive earthworm. And I think that's a really wonderful question. As an ecologist, I think it's always important to be cognizant that if you're going to take these worms and then put them into your garden, they're potentially going to spread into the ecosystem. However, the benefit of the red wiggler is that they're kind of a finicky species. They don't do very well in a less than ideal setting. And both studies from Cornell and the USDA have not seen any real red flags that these are going to become some explosive invasive species. But that being said, I think it's always important to check with your local USDA, make sure that you have an environment that's not going to allow these worms to completely proliferate and potentially become a pest. The last kind of home style of composting that I want to introduce is something called Bokashi composting, or effective microbial composting. This is a unique type of composting that's different from the other systems, because this is the one time that you want to avoid as much air in your compost pile as possible. Because what Bokashi does is it uses fermentation processes as opposed to a normal aerobic or anaerobic decomposition process. This is a really great option for individuals in small spaces, because it's just focused on adding nutrients and resources that are kitchen scraps, so things that you're probably generating, and not so much the yard waste that individuals in kind of households might be generating. The way that this works is you get a bucket, you add your kitchen scraps, and you push them down. In fact, you're going to try to get as much of the air out of them as possible. Now, you do need a special starter, a microbial starter called Bokashi bran. And this is a microbial community that's optimized to ferment this food. And then you want to add a cover on there so that it's nice and tightly sealed. You don't have air coming in. And then in a relatively short amount of time, you can get what's known as Bokashi tea. It's the runoff from this process, and it's a great thing to add into your soil. It's a great option for small spaces in particular, but know that it does take a little bit of an input to start, because you do have to find the right resources to get this set up. And then the last type of composting I just want to mention is the industrial or commercial composting. So this isn't stuff that we would be doing in our households. This is much larger scale, a controlled process that really focuses on high volume. And the reason I want to emphasize that this is an important resource is that we oftentimes get things that say, oh, biodegradable or a compostable plastic. And these are things that most of the time are not going to be very compostable in your home compost bin. While they can be composted, it's going to take a little bit more finesse and input. And so those are things that you want to be bringing to a commercial facility that can really focus on these more complex materials. And then, of course, there's one more way to compost, and this is the easiest way, I would say, and a great way for all of us, especially if you're not interested in starting a compost pile at home. And that's to just collect your food scraps and resources and bring them to kind of more communal compost piles. I think what's happening a lot more frequently is that farmers markets are creating an opportunity for you to bring your food scraps and they go into a communal compost system. Quite a few municipalities are also allowing for a drop off of food scraps as they create municipal composts. And in fact, though it's not the most common yet, some municipalities are doing curbside pickup. So just like you'd have your trash and your recycling outside your door, they're also coming and picking up your compost. We also have, particularly in the Millbrook area, some farms that are accepting the compost and food scraps while they generate their own compost piles. And then finally, there's an option to do some composting memberships where some companies will allow you to bring your food scraps. Maybe you pay a small fee, but they're going to do all the work to generate compost. And then at the end of the year, they'll allow you to come pick up compost and generate your own gardens at home with this communal compost resource. So these are really great options if you don't have the space at home, but you still want to think about how to contribute and compost to keep your food out of landfills. So that's really the main focus of my intro to composting from the presentation side, but I'm really excited now. We're going to transition into our demonstration that's going to focus on how to get started with bin composting at home. Now, if you have any questions, we're going to try to do some live Q&A while we're doing this demonstration. So please use that Q&A box to bring in some questions, and we'll be excited to see how this all goes. Awesome, wonderful. So sorry, now remind me, Lori, have you done some composting in the past?
I have, mostly the yard-based larger piles.
Wonderful.
And really curious to learn more about this smaller style of composting.
Great.
Because I'm in a situation now where I don't have a large piece of land.
Perfect.
So, yeah.
Well, today we're going to get started with bin composting, and we have different steps, but the very first step, as you probably assume, to bin composting is that you need to acquire a bin. So we have an example bin here. This is just one of those kind of 55 gallon tubs that many of us have at home. It's just a storage bin. It's great because it is a dark color, which we really like for our compost bins. This allows us to regulate the temperature. It also keeps it relatively warm.
And Jane's going to tell us about these holes and why they're there and why they're critical.
Absolutely. It might be hard to see here, but what we have is all along the top here, these are holes to make sure that we have that airflow. We want to make sure that you get that oxygen into your compost bin. We will eventually put a cover on our bin, but we don't want it to be airtight, right? We want to avoid anaerobic conditions. So these holes allow us to get that airflow. Now we also have at the bottom here, we've drilled lots of different holes into the bottom, and that's both, again, for airflow, and it's also going to be a really great way to allow that excess water to drain off, so we're avoiding that soggy material.
And one of the benefits of these bins is to have a lid that you can snap on.
Absolutely. So I recommend doing this type of bin because you can get this on there. It's going to make it hard for animals to get in. Once you've already made your whole compost pile, you put this right on top. Maybe put some extra weights to make sure that those pesky raccoons don't get at all a chance to get in there. Now that's our ideal bin situation, but today, because we want you to see what's happening inside the compost bin, we're going to be using this aquarium. Like I mentioned, we don't exactly love this for our compost at home because it allows for lots of light to get in and out. We want to keep it nice and dark and good for the different organisms in there. But this will be our demonstration bin today.
And so you'll see me occasionally looking over to my side here, and that's because Erin Frick is putting your questions in this iPad so I can feed them into the conversation. And we love them, and they're coming in. And somebody asked, should we allow rain in to the bin?
Oh, that's a really great question. It is definitely an option. You can have some rain come into your bin, but my biggest recommendation is probably to avoid it. It's hard to regulate the amount of water when you're just allowing for that natural rain. You can, of course, collect the rain and use that as a water source later on. But I think in general, unless you're doing that open air composting where you're really allowing it to be open to the elements, it's probably better to avoid adding natural rain. It's going to get wet. It's going to get soggy. And another nice thing that you can do with a bin compost is put a couple of bricks or something underneath it that allows the water to drain off, and it won't allow for that kind of soggy. If it is rainy outside, you won't get any water seepage from below.
And a lot of the bins have a depression. So if water fills in that depression, you can certainly add that in.
Exactly. Great. So once you've obtained your bin, our next step is to do a building of a base. This is a kind of a great first start for your compost bin. So what I'm going to have Lori do here is add some coarse sticks to the bottom of our compost bin. These are going to be hard to break down. They're not really going to be a final product of compost, but what they do is they add a nice amount of structure to the base of your compost bin, and they also allow for that drainage and air to flow through. So again, you're not getting that soggy, wet compost at the bottom of your bin. And just like if you were trying to start a fire, you want to add some coarser debris in there and some finer sticks. And this is just a really nice way to make sure that your compost pile is slightly raised up and it'll allow for that good airflow. Beautiful, lovely. And I think we're aiming for about 1 to 2 inches. So not a ton, you don't need a ton in there, just enough to add a little bit of structure.
Excellent. This is something when you're doing your yard pruning, you can just put some to the side.
Absolutely, absolutely. My dog always helps me collect the sticks, although sometimes she doesn't give it back to me. So, you know, that's how it goes. So once we built a nice base on our compost bin, our next step here is going to be to create that really important brown layer. All right, so we have lots of items today to add to our brown layer. The first thing that we're going to start with are things that most of us have around the house. In particular, those of us who've been maybe Amazon shopping a little bit, we probably have some extra packing material, some cardboard. This is a really great, coarse, nice, high carbon thing to add to your compost system. Now, what I'm having Lori do here is chop it up into some finer materials. The thing with microbes is they're pretty small. So the smaller the things we can put in there, the easier it is for them to access it. This isn't 100% mandatory. If you just want to throw things in there, it'll be fine. But we're trying to show you what an ideal maximized compost system looks like. So it's always great if you can and have the time to rip up, make smaller pieces in your compost bin. And for this layer, we're going to try to aim for about 5 to 7 inches of browns.
And we have a lot of questions about papers.
Absolutely.
Folks are wondering, what about papers with a wax coating from crackers or cereal boxes?
That is a great question. It's probably going to be difficult for the things that are coated really high ink to be in your compost bin. You can always double check, look online, see if by chance they're doing their coating with something that is degradable, but oftentimes things are going to be more toxic if they have lots of inks or waxy coatings on them. So if you do have something like an Amazon package at home, you maybe want to take that plastic tape off of it so that you're not adding that into your compost pile.
And what about newspaper ink? Is that
okay? So newspaper ink is really interesting. It used to be a petroleum base, so not something you would want to be putting in your compost pile. But as of course, oil got more expensive, they looked for cheaper and easier options. And so what we ended up doing is now using a soy-based ink for most newspapers. So newspaper is a really great thing to put into your compost pile.
And how about inkjet paper?
Inkjet is tough. In general, you're going to want to avoid inkjet paper. If you have just a little bit of ink on there, it might be okay, but highly ink, a full sheet of paper with text on it is not great for your compost bin. It's going to leach some chemicals in there. It's not great for microbial growth. It's not great for us to consume.
And we have a question from the Facebook feed about, they thought that 24 carbon to 1 nitrogen was the ideal ratio, or has that changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, I think most of the things that I've been researching and seeing is saying 30 now. You're really close, 24 to 30. Those are going to be pretty similar carbon to nitrogen ratios. If you hit 24, my guess is you're going to have a pretty happy compost system. But I guess now it seems like 30 generally tends to be ideal. And I would say that it's better to aim a little bit more on the browns than it is on the greens, because I'd rather have a little bit slower but not too soggy of compost than too wet and starting to get stinky.
And several questions about wood ash. Is it good? Is it bad? How much do we add?
Wood ash is a great part of your compost system. It can be a great savior if you've gone too far into your greens, if you get too wet, but it is extremely high in carbon. That's the close to 700 to 1. So you don't want to be putting a ton of that into your compost pile. But if you are getting a little too soggy, you're getting too many greens in your compost, wood ash can be a great way to bring it back. You want to make sure that it's wood ash, no other ashes from coal, anything from your fire that maybe has some type of additive on it. You want to avoid that. And we have a couple other browns here. So we're going to also add a nice layer of our lawn collections from last fall. These are the types of things that you could potentially save and use throughout the summer as you're really trying to get your compost highly active. And the more you can just kind of grind them up, create lots of texture in there, the better it is. And one of the things is that kind of like us, microbes like a nice, healthy, diverse diet. So the more diversity you can add, not just composting with one type of leaf, not just adding cardboard, microbes are going to be really happy with that nice mixture.
Are there any leaves or wood that we should avoid?
There are certain types, in particular treated woods. There are, I believe chestnut is a type of wood that sometimes can produce a compound that's difficult for microbes to survive. So it's good to double check. I would say most of the time things that are happening naturally, you just see a tree branch in your yard, it's going to be okay to compost. But if you're trying to super maximize the efficiency of your compost pile, it might be good to double check, okay, oak leaves are great, but should I, be careful with another type of leaf? Pine needles are really great. You want to make sure they're a little bit on the drier side. But other than that, they're a really great addition to our compost pile.
And we had someone ask if they were primarily using leaves as their brown, approximately how long would it take to turn those leaves into compost?
Yeah. So if you weren't adding anything else and you were just trying to compost those leaves that you collected over the summer or over the fall, maybe, it's going to take a while, because leaves, when they've left their tree, what happens oftentimes is trees try to suck all of the last nutrients back into the tree when it goes into that winter time. And so it's mostly just a high carbon, not super rich resource for microbial life. So you might be looking at about a year for just the leaves to be broken down. Again, you want to make sure you're mixing, you're adding water to that. But the best thing to do is to add a little bit of greens, bring some nitrogen into that leaf pile, and that's going to be able to kickstart your leaves to really decompose quickly. All right, so our last brown that we're going to use is some straw. You can be pretty judicious with this. You can add that in. It's a nice, diverse. The nice thing about this straw is that it's already nicely, finely chopped up, so it can be a great option for our microbes. They're going to be able to easily access that. And straw is another great option for those of us, if you maybe have too wet of compost, too many greens, straw can be an easy way to balance out your compost pile. And now we can see that we built up about a 5 to 7 inch base of our browns, and we have a really great setup for our microbial life. All righty, so that's our brown layer. Now, the next layer I want to emphasize is definitely an optional choice here. And this is to add something called a compost starter. So here we have a compost starter. This is just a kind of dehydrated microbial community. And the idea with these starters is that it's going to bring a nice, wealthy microbiome into your compost pile and really help it kickstart. But the thing with compost starter is that you really don't need a lot of it. So something like this, we probably add about a half of a cup into our system. And I want to emphasize, you absolutely don't have to do this. This is just a way to like maximize the efficiency of your compost production. But you know, one thing to note is everything that you put into your compost pile is going to have microbes on it. You're not using anything that's sterile, so it's already going to have microbial life. This is just a nice way to maybe make sure you're getting a more rapid expansion of your compost.
We have a friend or neighbor who's actively composting. Can we just borrow some of their compost?
Absolutely. That's a really great way to do it. If you have a friend who already has a nice productive compost system, you can take just a cup or so of their compost, spread it into yours. That'll bring a nice rich microbial community in, and it'll be able to break down and help boost your compost pile. Nice. All righty. So now, you know, that's totally optional, but we're just trying to give you all the options here. And now the next, of course, very important step 5 here is to add our green layer. And we have lots of greens available to us. But the first thing I'm going to start with, which is technically not a green and not quite a brown, it's the eggshell. This is a great resource for our compost pile.
And we had a couple questions about the eggshells as well. Someone was wondering, should they be crushed?
Yes, I really recommend crushing up the eggshells. You'll probably notice if you just take a half of an eggshell and put it in your compost pile, it doesn't break down very well. It is a tough material for microbes to access, but it is really important. It has, of course, great calcium in there, which is great for our plant growth. But the more you can kind of blend it together, crush it in your hands, smaller pieces, it's going to be a lot easier for the microbes to digest, and then it's going to more activate that calcium into your compost pile.
And someone else was wondering, do the eggs need to be heated to kill bacteria and to keep away animals that might be interested?
Oh, that's a good point. If you're just dealing with an eggshell, you're probably fine. You're not going to be having a lot of excess egg in there. We do most of the time want to avoid eggs themselves in our compost pile unless you have those really well-contained tumblers that are going to be able to possibly handle an egg product. If you, but in general, I would say avoid putting an actual egg product inside of your compost and just stick with the eggshells. All right, so once we've got a nice bit of eggshells, we're also going to add in some banana peels. It's kind of crazy how quickly bananas generally tend to turn, but these are our banana peels from this morning's breakfast. And I'm going to have Lori go ahead and add the banana peels in, but I'm going to have her break it up into smaller pieces because, again, I'm going to say it again and again, microbes like small bits. So the more we can blend these up, the better. Of course, if you don't want to do it, it will be fine to just add a full peel in there. It's not going to be the end of the world. But if you're trying to maximize your compost efficiency, smaller pieces is the best way to go. And just like us, microbes need some calcium and some potassium. And this potassium from our bananas are a great way to add that to our microbes and eventually to the plants we grow with our compost. All right. Now, once we've added that, we're also going to add kind of the traditional kitchen scraps. So here I made fajitas in a salad last night. So we're going to have some leftover onion, not too much, of course. We have some bits of pepper. We also have salad, kind of dressed salad that hasn't been dressed. So we're trying to avoid oil being put into our compost pile. We're trying to keep most of the compost in the pile, but
that's the goal.
Yeah. And so, but one thing that you can already see is this is just from last night, and you're starting to see that there's quite a bit of moisture in our greens. And that's something to think about because most greens are going to have a lot of water content inside of them. So when we are adding water later on, we want to take into account that there's already quite a bit of water in our compost from these fresh greens.
Absolutely.
And another thing that we're going to add that's also quite high in water content is fruit. So maybe you have fruit that's just started to mold. Some of them you're kind of leftovers, you're not going to take those final berries. It's fine to add that into your compost pile, but fruit is very high in water content. Yep, you can see it. I'm glad you're wearing gloves, but it's definitely something that you want to be aware of, that maybe if you're adding a lot of fruit to your compost pile, you don't need to keep putting as much water in there. Great. And then the last green that we're going to go for is lawn clippings. And I think this is a really great item that a lot of us might be interested in composting in our households. But the biggest thing to know with the lawn clippings is that if you add too many of them at once and you don't get a lot of air and mixture of your lawn clippings, you're going to get kind of soggy, gooey, wet compost. So we do want to make sure we're breaking it up and spreading it around. And then in this next step, as we mix our compost, we're going to make sure that we don't have giant clumps of grass.
One question a number of people have asked,
Yes,
which grass reminds me of, is how do you compost weeds?
yes.
And if we're pulling weeds and there's some garden soil on them, can we bring that to the compost?
Absolutely, you can do that. It's okay to compost weeds. The biggest thing you want to be aware of is that if you're trying to use your compost to eventually grow your own garden and you have seeds from those weeds in your pile, it's going to be difficult because it's just going to be planting a whole bunch of seeds from your weed. So one of the things that you want to do is either pull weeds before they're going to seed, or you really want to make sure that your compost pile gets really hot, because when you hit those high temperatures above 160 or so, you're going to make it difficult for those seeds to survive. So those are kind of the two options. You can definitely put weeds in there. You might end up kind of growing some of them in your garden and just keep rotating them through the cycle. Oh, hold on one sec here. I think we just lost our camera.
We will be coming back in a moment. And we had another question. I just want to reiterate this one. I know that it was covered in the PowerPoint, but while you can put pet hair and human hair in your compost pile, you do not want to put pet waste in there.
No, absolutely. Yeah, pet waste in particular is something that's difficult for your compost pile, because a lot of the times what happens with pet waste is that your pets can often have pathogens that are either, of course, harmful to them or potentially harmful for us. And you want to make sure that we're not adding those pathogens into the soil and then trying to grow our fruits and veggies in the same stuff that eventually would be harmful to us.
And we have one more question about, is it okay to compost garlic and spices?
Oh, that's a good question. The biggest thing to note for different spices is whether or not it's going to change the pH pretty dramatically in your system. Different types of the garlic is going to be okay. You probably don't want to overdo it on garlic. That's a pretty potent thing, and oftentimes garlic can be an antimicrobial. So you do want to be aware that if you're adding garlic, in particular, the surrounding parts of the garlic is great, but maybe that true bulb, I mean, that's the thing that we're going to try to eat anyway. So maybe we don't want to be tossing that valuable resource into our compost pile.
And this is kind of harkening back to the browns. We also had a question come in, is it okay to compost pine cones?
That is another really good question. It's going to be tough to compost a pine cone. It's okay. They're very tough to break down. They have a lot of defensive compounds, and they're also going to be high in carbon. It's possible, but they're going to be really slow. So you're probably not going to be making a lot of compost quickly with a pine cone.
And if we have cow manure and it's 1 year mature, can we use that?
That is a good question. I would say, hold on one sec here while we're just trying to get our camera back on. But I think that in general, cow manure can be a really great way to kickstart your compost pile, because cow manure has a nice microbial community to it, and it also has a lot of nitrogen in it. So I would double check. When it gets longer, it's probably still okay. You just want to make sure that maybe it hasn't been colonized by pathogens, but as long as you're adding it into your system, you're getting warm enough compost, it should be an okay resource.
And what about those cornstarch packing peanuts that come in our boxes?
Those are, I think, a really great example of something that we wish that was more compostable at home, but really is only going to be compostable if you're if you're doing it more on an industrial scale. So
Right.
as much as I'd like to say that they're great for home compost, you're probably better off bringing them to a home or to a more industrial compost system. And then the last compost, green, which I mentioned is a little bit misleading because it's actually brown, is our coffee grounds. So I think coffee grounds are a really great thing to add. We generate quite a bit of them every day because if you're like me, you're drinking coffee every morning. And they can be a great source of nitrogen to our system. One thing again to note is that coffee grounds are often quite wet. So we don't want to be adding them in huge chunks and then just letting them sit. We want to make sure they're mixed well in our compost pile. And then the other thing to think about is that you can sometimes dry them out. One of the things to note is that, coffee itself is pretty acidic, but coffee grounds are generally less acidic because the acid from coffee kind of drains off. And therefore, the actual grounds end up not being too acidic. So it's great for your compost pile. And if you choose a compostable coffee ground, or coffee filter, you can just take that filter, rip it up and put it right in there, just
That
like
was
Lori did.
the next question, is the filter. Okay.
Yeah, you double check. Some filters are treated with bleach. They're probably not the best things to be putting in your compost pile, but a lot of filters are compostable.
So go for the unbleached if you can.
If you can, yeah, definitely.
And just, when you're doing your kitchen scrap composting, you can get any kind of lidded container, just as a random example, but there's lots of options out there, even a larger coffee can with a lid or some such, and just make it easier on yourself. And once you have that container full, you can bring it out to your box or pile.
Exactly. All right, so now that we've got a really nice brown layer and we have a nice green layer, our next step here is step 6, which is to mix it all together. Now remember, we did add sticks into the bottom, and it's probably not something, you don't need to get those sticks mixed all the way up. But the big thing we want to do here is make sure that our browns and our greens are well mixed with each other. So go ahead, Lori, mix them all together. Try to really homogenize this mixture. This is a great way not only to make sure that your browns and greens are kind of coming in contact with each other, but as you can see, it kind of fluffs it, it brings more air, it brings a lot of diverse texture to your compost pile, and it's going to be a really happy environment for those microbes in there.
And mixing might not be everyone's favorite thing to do, but as you're saying, it also can kind of keep the smell down.
Absolutely. It's really important. There are different tools to do it. You can get these fancy mixtures, but the biggest thing in particular with bin composting is that people maybe mix the top, but they don't get far enough down, and they don't really get that stuff that tends to be soggy at the bottom. And so you really want to work to mix it. And I think about once or maybe twice a week, you'll have to monitor the moisture in your compost pile, but about once or twice a week should be more than sufficient to keep your compost well mixed, aerated, lots of oxygen in there.
And one of the questions was, do different composting styles have different turning requirements, open air versus bin?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Oftentimes the tumblers and a bin compost, they're one and the same. You maybe once, twice a week. It's less so much the actual type of system and what you have in them. So if you have a pretty dry compost pile, you may not need to be mixing that as much because there's already quite a bit of air pockets in there. So it's less about that style. Now, if you have vermicompost, that does probably require less mixing because the worms are actually doing the mixing for you. And then the Bokashi, that completely fermentation, no oxygen system, doesn't need to be mixed. In fact, you want to avoid that because you want to keep a really low oxygen content in that system.
And we had a question, what do you do when you have an outdoor pile and it's incredibly large? How do you turn it? At some point it becomes
I think you have a party and you invite your friends to come compost with you. No, it is a tough thing. And that's the hardest part about that open air system, and particularly those really large systems. Getting a good fork, a big pitchfork is helpful. Making sure that maybe you have a friend to help you mix your compost. But that does become maybe the hardest part with open air composting, is the larger it gets, when it rains, it's going to be heavy. So it can be difficult, and you just kind of have to figure out, there are certain tools that can help with rotating the inside of that. But unfortunately, maybe takes a couple people.
And one of our registrants asked, how can you tell if your compost material is composting and not just rotting?
That is a really great question. The biggest indicator are just the simple things, you know, using your eyes and ears and nose. Mostly your nose is going to be indicative here. If it starts to smell, things like that sulfur smell, that's a great indicator that you do not have good decomposition happening and you're getting kind of that sulfur production. So the best thing to look is the smell. You can also monitor the temperature. That's going to be, if it's not getting high, if you're not seeing those temperatures increase, that's a really good indicator that you're just getting rotten food happening inside of there. So you do want to see that increase in temperature. And you can just use, you know, any type of thermometer. You can use one that are good for soil. They're about $2 to $10 online, and you just stick that in the center of your pile and watch for that. Other things to look for is a slimy kind of coating. That's an indicator that you're getting rotten compost. And what happens is when you go out there and you turn your compost pile, you'll be able to see, are you getting gooey bits? That's an indicator that you're not getting enough oxygen. You probably have too much water. So unfortunately, you're probably getting in the more rotten side of compost, but you can save it, right? You can add some more browns. You can come back from those tough kind of rotten options and just try to rebalance out your 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio.
And adding that straw or that
wood ash. Yep, exactly.
Will help soak that up. And so we had another great question. How do the mesophiles recolonize the compost after the thermophilic phase?
Oh, that is such a good question. There's a couple things. First, most of there are lots of mesophiles that will they just go into a dormancy, so they're able to just hang out. Yes, mesophilic bacteria and fungi are those. They kind of like the moderate temperatures, things between 20 to 40 degrees Celsius, and the other thing is that they are just a naturally colonizing compound. So when you're out and you're adding new nutrients to your compost pile, they're going to bring in new microbial life. But the great thing about microbes is that normally in any scoop of soil, you have more microbes in that scoop than there are humans on Earth. So there's tons of different microbes there, and they kind of go in these dormancy phases. So when it's really hot, some of those microbes will just kind of turn off. Fungi are extremely resilient. They may not be active really well at that high temperature, but they might still just persist. And as soon as those temperatures come back into their ideal range, then they start to kick back on and outcompete those thermophiles. But what a great question. All right, now our next step here is step number 7, and this is the watering phase. And this is the phase that we really want to be the most careful with, because we do want to make sure we have enough moisture in our compost pile, but we really want to avoid overdoing the water. And I would say that even our moisture right now is looking pretty good, but we're going to add just a little bit of moisture, maybe about half of a cup to our compost pile. Again, I want to emphasize we're looking for that 40 to 60% water content, or kind of similar to a wrung out sponge. And the best thing with compost is maybe to start your compost pile, leave it for a day or so, see how much water is in there, because a lot of those greens are going to have quite a bit of water. And then eventually you'll see, okay, it looks like it's starting to dry out. Now I'm going to add water. You may not want to initially add a ton of water, because once you go too much water, it becomes a lot harder to manage your compost pile. Wonderful. And so now it's probably a little bit hard to see on camera, but we have this, it looks slightly damp, but it's not soaking wet. You can see in the bottom of our bin here, we don't have any standing water. We still have airflow underneath there, and that's going to be ideal for our microbial life. Really, when in doubt, go more dry than too wet. Alrighty, and then our next step here is, this is a final stage of our composting that, again, is optional, but I'm going to offer these as a really good option for those of us who are particularly concerned about animal pests in our compost pile. Now, this is basically a ready-to-go compost bin. We could cover it up and let it be and just come check on it once a week and mix it up. But one of the things you can do to limit the amount of pests that come to it are to add another layer of soil on top. This isn't going to be a compost starter, And it's just going to be a little bit of soil that's going to mask the scent of our compost.
And that was probably one of the most asked questions tonight.
Yeah.
How do we keep the animals away from the compost pile?
Absolutely. And when you have something like a bin or even an open air compost system, if you can take it, now that it's all set and put this layer of soil on top of it, we're almost done here. We're just finishing up. And this is a great way that animals might walk by. They're just going to see that, good old layer of soil, and they're not going to be as attracted. So this is a great way to limit animal exposure.
And we had a question about, can ammonia be used to keep bears out of your compost?
Yeah, that's a great and a kind of a unique way to keep, if you're worried about bears, which particularly here in Millbrook, we've been having quite a few. One of the things you can do is add some ammonia around your compost pile. I think you have to be a little bit careful with adding it to the bin. You can mix 1/2 of a cup of ammonia with 16 ounces of beer and create a really great compost starter that way. It's called drunken compost. But if you're just trying to deter animals, ammonia is pretty rich in nitrogen. So it's better to add it around your compost bin. Most of the time, animals, especially bears, will smell that. It smells intense. They don't like that smell and they'll stay away. You can put it on a rag. It'll get kind of deter them. And that way it's not going in your compost bin, but it's a way to mask the scent of your compost.
And if you find wildlife are in your compost pile, is it still okay to use the compost? Was a question that came
Oh, that's a very good, yes, it absolutely is. It probably means you have just some really interesting things in there. Now we have a couple wildlife, we have different types of isopods, and we have some earthworms that might naturally colonize your bin or your bins. That's great. Those are really important. Roly-polies are one of my favorite parts of the composting process. Maybe you've seen them before. I'm not sure if this will come across, but these are just those pill bugs that many of us can have in our yards. They're great for adding to your compost bin because what they do is they take your little pieces of compost and shred them up even more. So wildlife is all right in your bin. If you have other types of wildlife that have colonized it, it's still going to be okay. The only thing you want to be a little bit aware of is if you have a lot of rodents and they're creating a lot of waste in there, you just might need to be a little bit cautious when you're using that as a food source or to grow your garden. But again, as long as you can heat your compost pile up enough, it's not going to be attractive to animals. 180 degrees Fahrenheit is not going to be great for a mouse. So it's going to be a great way to deter animals as well.
And this probably gets to the next question. Would maggots ruin my compost?
Yeah, in general, probably not, but of course, they're probably not preferable for most of us. There are different ways you can mitigate that. One of the things you can do is just allow your compost to dry out for a while. That's really tough for most organisms to live in. And once you've allowed your compost to dry out, you can either just not add water to your compost bin. You could take another step and lay it out on a tarp and extra dry it out. That's a way to get kind of any invasive insects out of there. And then you can just restart it by adding some more greens and browns and you're ready to go again.
And someone was wondering, are any cooking oils okay to add? What if they're plant-based?
It's a good question. It's not great. It's normally a way to attract animals to your composting bin. Some of them can be composted. It's also not ideal for the microbial life. It generally tends to be more difficult for them to access. So it's not the best thing to add to your composting bin. But let's say you were cooking some veggies and you had a little bit of oil on them. That's not going to be detrimental, but you don't want to be taking, maybe you fried potatoes and you have a ton of this leftover oil. You don't want to be just pouring that in there. That's not going to be great for your composting process.
And if one was interested in compost worms, where would they find those?
Yeah, it seems like there's this one company that has a monopoly on composting worms, and I can't remember their name. It's like Mr. Fred's or something. I've gotten mine online, but some garden stores do carry them, but most of the time you're going to get your worms in the mail, like I just did the other week, and they just arrive in a box and you rehydrate them and they're quite happy. So just look online. Look up red wiggler, composting worms, lots of options.
So pet waste is a no-no, but folks are wondering, what about chicken and hog manure?
Yeah, I think that you have to be you kind of have to be careful with how much of that you add to it. Maybe you want to compost that on its own, and it can be a great resource, but it can be really high in specific types of nutrients. It does have a lot of nitrogen in it, so you couldn't add a ton of it to your compost pile. It's going to be difficult, but I think in general you're in okay shape. You just need to think about what's the end goal for your compost, and how quick do you need to create it.
And how about, can you use the same compost pile over time, just keep adding and using?
Yeah.
Or should you start a new pile periodically?
No, adding to your pile is really great because you've already got that great starter community there. Now, you probably need to make sure you're mixing it really well and taking off a good portion of that. Eventually compost is going to get to a point where it's not going to decompose anymore, but I think adding to your compost pile is a really great thing because it's already kick-started. You already have a happy microbiome.
And what is the biggest tell that your compost is ready to use?
Well, for me, the biggest tell generally tends to be, you can look at it. It looks like this beautiful humus material. It's nice, dark color. It's going to be kind of the consistency that's spongy. It's not going to have a putrid smell. It's not going to be stinky. It's going to be really kind of that lovely earthy smell that I think most of us are fond of. A good indicator is whether or not you're seeing that stabilization in temperature at the end. It does generally take a while. You're looking at 3 to 4 months if you're maximized in efficiency, but especially over the winter months, you might be needing to wait till that next spring for it to finally restart. So, you do just need to be patient with your compost pile, but you're looking for something that looks kind of like great topsoil in the end.
And what are your thoughts about compost bins that can be buried directly into a garden? And a sub pod was
yeah, those can be really helpful. They generally, the way that those work is they're just kind of leaching some of the nutrients into the system. The biggest thing you want to be aware of is that you do still want to mix those well, and if you aren't doing that, then maybe what happens is you get this base layer on the bottom that's starting to rot, and then that's not really great for your compost pile. But there is a style of composting that's just kind of burying compost, and the bin compost directly in your garden bin is a great option. And what you do often want is a good, healthy kind of native earthworm or some type of animal to help move that material around. But other than that, no, it's a great option, and it cuts down on the type of work you have to do.
And for the container composting with the bin that we showed earlier, should there be holes in the lid or should there not be holes in the lid?
You can add them, but they are not necessary. You want to make sure that there's a good amount of airflow, and the best way to tell that is just kind of as you're creating it, you want to, as you pull off your lid, does it smell? Are you starting to get into that kind of funky side of compost? Then you might want to add more holes to it. One of the reasons I generally avoid putting it in the very top of the bin, and I like it just around the kind of this outside rim, is that allows for that airflow, but it doesn't allow for rain to infiltrate from the top. So it just kind of depends on where your compost bin is. If you're in a low airflow, so if you're inside, maybe you want to have more holes in your compost bin.
And we just have so many wonderful questions coming in, and it is
good.
8:15.
Yes,
so
it
recognizing
is.
the time, we'll take a couple more.
All right, we'll take a couple more. We're so appreciative of all the questions, and especially, if we don't get to you, please know that we can do some following up, but we really appreciate everybody being so excited about this.
Absolutely. So one of the questions was, how can I keep my compost working when I have really cold winters like we do here in New York State and other parts of the country?
Yes, that's a really good question. The first and foremost is be patient with your compost because it is going to slow down in the winter, and that is absolutely okay. Microbes are kind of like us. They don't like to work hard when it's freezing cold outside. It's hard to be super efficient running around out there. So you can bring your compost bin inside so that it keeps a more stable temperature. You can also make sure that your compost bin or your piles are in a high sun location. So even in the wintertime, they're still getting a good amount of heat. And you can also do things to insulate it. So when we put this soil on the top and that nice kind of leaf litter, that's a great insulator. So maybe when you're thinking about overwintering, you want to add that nice buffer layer on top. And then when you're adding your new nutrients, maybe throughout the wintertime, you want to kind of create a whole bury them inside and then recover that up, because soil and leaf litter are just a great natural insulator for your compost.
So maybe one more?
Yeah, one more question. All right.
So is there anything that is dry that can become a nitrogen source for a compost pile?
Oh man, people are asking very good question. I mean, yes, right. You can dry your coffee grounds and there's still a nitrogen source. There are lots of options. Trying to think of most, I mean, the biggest thing that happens is most greens, that when you dry them out, they're going to leach those nitrogen compounds. So that's what's happening with, initially your lawn clippings are nice and rich in nitrogen, but then quickly nitrogen gets accessed, it starts to leach out of and then what's left is the carbon. So things that are green and then turn brown are often an indicator that they're going to have less nitrogen content in them. So what you want to look for are things that maybe are naturally dry. So things like a coffee ground is a naturally dry thing that you can bring into your compost bin.
Excellent. And with that, I think we're going to close the evening's program. We, like I said, have some excellent questions that maybe could become a blog post in the future. And if we do that, we will send it out to all of you that registered. Absolutely. And I can foresee some more composting programs in our future.
Great. So, yeah. And thank you all so much for participating. And thank you for sticking with us through some of our technical difficulties. Absolutely. But this has been so wonderful and fun. And I really appreciate all of the interest you've had.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Good night.